All right, let's dive in. Today we're talking about one of the biggest quests in human history, really. It's the attempt to scientifically understand the most complicated thing in the known universe, the human mind.
It all kicks off with a question that I bet you've asked yourself 1,000 times. You look in the mirror, you think about your personality, your talents, even your fears, and you just wonder, was this all baked in from the start? Was I just born this way? But then, of course, you think about your family, the town you grew up in, all the things you've been through, and you ask the complete opposite. How much of who I am is just a product of my life? How much did the world actually shape me into the person I am today? And that tension, right there, is the heart of one of psychology's oldest and most epic debates, nature versus nurture. So on one side, you've got nature. That's your DNA, your biology, the raw materials. And on the other, you've got nurture. That's every experience, every lesson, every interaction you've ever had. And for literally centuries, almost every big idea about who we are started right here.
But, nature versus nurture is just the beginning. The whole field of psychology is really built on these huge, timeless questions, like are you actually in the driver's seat of your life, or are things more predetermined? And how much of your own mind is a mystery even to you? These are the kinds of deep, fascinating puzzles that keep psychologists up at night.
So, for thousands of years, these questions were just for philosophers to argue about over a glass of wine. But then, something totally radical happened. We stopped just talking about the mind, and we started bringing it into the lab to actually measure it.
This debate goes way, way back. Yeah, the ancient Greeks. Plato, he was 100% team nature. He thought we were born with all this knowledge already inside us. But then his own student, Aristotle, he was firmly on team nurture. He believed we're all born as a tabula rasa, a total blank slate, and life just writes our story for us.
And that's pretty much how it was for centuries. Just a really interesting debate. But then in the late 1800s, the whole game changed. Guys like Wilhelm Wundt over in Germany and William James here in the States, they opened the very first psychology labs. They moved from just arguing to actually collecting data. Psychology was finally becoming a real science.
Just look at this timeline for a second. You've got millennia of pure philosophical debate, and then, boom, in the span of just a few decades in the late 1800s, the whole thing explodes with scientific study. This wasn't just turning a new page, it was like writing a completely different book.
Okay, so now that they had labs and experiments, these first psychologists had a seriously bold mission. They wanted to map our inner world. They wanted to figure out, what is consciousness actually made of? What are the building blocks?
And this led to the first big schools of thought, each with its own game plan for cracking the code of the mind. We're going to look at 4 of the big ones: structuralism, functionalism, the psychodynamic school, and the cognitive approach. And trust me, they all went about it in completely different ways.
So first up, you have structuralism. And their goal was, well, incredibly ambitious. They wanted to create something like a periodic table of the elements, but for the mind. They used this technique called introspection, where they trained people to report on every single little thought, feeling, and sensation they had. They were trying to break consciousness down into its most basic parts.
Now, William James and the functionalists, they thought that was kind of pointless. They were heavily influenced by Darwin, so they weren't asking what the mind is made of. They asked a much more practical question. What is the mind for? Why did we evolve things like memory, or anger, or love? For them, the whole point of thinking was to help us survive and act in the world.
But maybe the most shocking idea came from this guy you might have heard of, Sigmund Freud. His psychodynamic theory suggested something really wild, that most of what drives our behavior is completely hidden from us. He was talking about this deep, dark, unconscious mind, filled with powerful urges, forgotten memories, and childhood experiences that we don't even know are there.
Fast forward a bit, and with the invention of the computer, you get the cognitive revolution. Cognitive psychologists started looking at the mind as a sort of information processor, like a biological computer. Their whole thing was studying the software, how we take in information, how we store it as memories, and how we pull it back out later to solve problems.
Now, while all these guys were busy trying to figure out what was happening inside our heads, a totally different group came along and said, whoa, 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 you're all looking in the wrong place. The real answers, they argue, aren't inside us at all. They're out there, in the world.
And this was behaviorism. The behaviorists basically declared that the mind is a black box. We can't see into it, so trying to study it is just unscientific guesswork. They said psychology should only focus on what we can actually see and measure. It's simple, right? A stimulus from the environment goes in, and a behavior comes out. That's it. Everything in between doesn't matter.
A perfect example is the famous and, pretty controversial Little Albert experiment. They took this baby, Albert, who loved playing with a little white rat. But then, every time he reached for the rat, they made a terrifyingly loud noise behind his head. And pretty soon, just seeing the rat was enough to make him burst into tears. The takeaway was huge. A powerful emotion, like fear, isn't necessarily something you're born with. It can be learned. It can be conditioned.
B.F. Skinner, who is probably the most famous behaviorist, put it really simply. He argued that our actions are just shaped by what happens next. If you do something and get a reward, you're more likely to do it again. If you get punished, you're less likely. In a way, he saw our environment as this constant training program that's always shaping us.
So this leads to a really tough question, one that the behaviorists weren't afraid to tackle. If everything we do is just a response to past rewards and punishments, are we really making free choices? They basically said, no, free will is an illusion. So, what do you think about that?
Now, this focus on the outside world didn't stop with behaviorism. The social-cultural approach widened the lens even more. It said you can't really understand a person without understanding their world, the people they're around, and the culture they live in.
Think about it like this. In many Western cultures, the big value is individualism. It's all about personal achievement, being your own person. But in a lot of East Asian cultures, the focus is on collectivism. What's best for the group, for the family, maintaining harmony. That one single difference in cultural values can change everything about a person, from how they see themselves to the choices they make in life. Okay, so we've had all these different teams, all these competing ideas. So where are we today? Who actually won the war for the soul of psychology? Well, the really cool answer is nobody. The battle's over.
See, modern psychology gets that there isn't one single right way to look at people. Every one of those historical schools we talked about gave us a valuable tool, a different lens to see through. That's why today most psychologists use what's called a biopsychosocial approach. It's all about combining insights from all angles, looking at our biology, our thoughts and feelings, and our social world to get the fullest possible picture of who we are.
So, as we finish up this whirlwind tour, I've got to turn the final question back to you. When you think about your own life, what makes you, you? Which one of these lenses feels like it explains the most? Is it your unconscious mind, your learned habits, the way you think, or the culture you grew up in? The real answer, of course, is that it's probably a little bit of all of them.